minds have been colonized. Yes, yours and mine. And no, I'm actually not talking about the next sci-fi thriller, Mind Colonizers from Outer Space. So let me explain. Where do you start when you want to take away a person's freedom? Do you begin by taking away their land, their children, the ways in which they worship or work? No, you start at the real frontier of freedom, a person's mind. You begin extracting their thoughts and inputting in your own. And that's dangerous for all the reasons we might suspect, but also because it limits our best selves, the best version of our thinking, of our dreaming, and ultimately the best co-creation of our world. And so, in order for us to truly be free, we have to decolonize our minds. So I bet you didn't think that your mind was colonized. I mean, well, I certainly didn't, but here's where my journey actually began. It began with Sister Mary Pat. So this is Sister Mary Pat, and she was with me during all of my formative years. I mean, she was kind and generous and loving. I mean, all the things you can see in her smile. But she was also incredibly strict. I mean, if you ever erred, there was an immediate and there was a swift consequence. And there's one other thing I guess I should tell you about Sister Mary Pat. She's actually my mom. Okay, I'll let that sink in for a second. Like the good nun she was, Sister Mary Pat was ministering to men in prison, and that's where she met my dad. And well, you might say that things went just a little bit off script. I mean, after all, you know, nuns don't meet their soulmates in jails because they really already have a soulmate. I mean, if you know what I mean. But alas, after about 20 years in the convent, Sister Mary Pat got pregnant with me, then decided to leave the convent, then married my dad, and eventually, as you could say, the rest is really history. So why do I tell you this? Perhaps your mind has been colonized too about what a nun does or doesn't do, or who that white nun in that picture was and how she relates to the black woman you see standing before you. But don't feel bad. It really happens to all of us. But our challenge is to do better and to be better and to really free the colonizers ultimately from our minds. It was thanks to my mom that I actually realized the whole notion of what it means to have a colonized mind. You see, I began my journey as an educator and became a principal shortly thereafter. I became the principal of Finger High School on the city's far south side of Chicago. And Finger was an incredible school, but it also had incredible challenges. Let me just give you an idea of what those challenges actually were. So we had about 1,400 young people at Finger High School. And out of those 1,400 young people on any given year, only 40% of them would ever graduate. 20% of them dropped out every single year, and there were roughly 300 arrests inside of the school building. I was drawn to Finger High School because it really represented the merging of two worlds, if you will. It was a chance for me to right the wrongs of what had happened with my dad and all the systems he had been involved in. But it was also a chance to practice some of those rules and consequences that my mother drilled into me in terms of making the world right. And so when I became the principal of Finger High School, I walked in that first day, rules and consequences in hand for my students to bring order. And along the way, I met a young man, one of my students, Jason, who was absolutely incredible. I mean, just picture this kind and loving young person. He was funny, he was smart, he loved basketball, he loved the fast food restaurant Wendy's. I mean, he was just the kind of kid that would, even at 15, give you the shirt off his back. So meet Jason. This is Jason. I wonder if this is who you pictured when I talked about Jason. And if not, why not? I think it's because the way our minds are colonized, again, of preconceived notions of people, of what we hear in the media, and the inputs that are put into our mind. I met a lot of young men at Finger High School who were like Jason. I mean, they might appear tough and tattooed or even angry or aloof, but actually they were incredibly fragile. They very similar to my dad in a lot of ways. After about a year and a half at Finger High School, I realized that all those rules and consequences that I brought to bear actually weren't changing those numbers that I mentioned earlier. There was really no difference. And that's when the journey of the decolonization of my mind actually began. I had to reach out to other people who were a part of the school community, with social workers and school counselors, community members, teachers, parents. And I had to ask, why wasn't it working? And what I found out after digging deeper was that our young people were incredibly traumatized. And they were traumatized by an incredibly harsh environment. I mean, just imagine having to walk back and forth from school on any given day and being concerned about your safety. And not just concerned about your general safety, but having to be worried about whether or not you'd make it home alive. Not to mention the unrelenting poverty that plagued our community. Once I really fully took that in, I had to change the question that I was asking of my young people in the school. I used to wonder, what was going on? I'd ask the question, what's wrong with you? But I had to change the question from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. And with a shift in that question, I mean, the whole game changed. We began to institute things like anger management and grief counseling. We embedded restorative practices and peace circles. We began to look at academic interventions in a different way and really look at the whole child. And once we began to do that, everything shifted with those numbers that didn't move before. The needle began to slowly progress. And before you know it, that 40% graduation rate went to over 80%. And that dropout rate that was once 20% went to down below 2%. And the 300 arrests that were happening inside of the school that first year slowly, over time, dwindled down to just 10. We disrupted the culture of fear and failure at Finger. And we created a trauma-informed template that got replicated not just across the city, but ultimately across the country. But the biggest thing that was transformed during all of this was me. I still love my mom, but she was no longer colonizing my mind. I went to Finger to transform that school. But that school transformed me.